Hi, I'm Monica Olson.
And I'm Jennifer Welch.
And you're listening to the Biophilic Solutions Podcast, where every other week we sit down with experts and thought leaders in order to explore the innate connection between humans and nature and why we need nature to thrive.
We truly believe that reconnecting with the natural world and understanding our place within nature is a key to tackling the global environmental problems we face today.
So let's get to today's episode.
Hey, Jennifer.
Hey, Monica.
So we're back sooner than we anticipated. We normally release an episode every other week, but decided to go ahead and do this one back to back for a couple reasons.
Yes, the first reason being we realized that on our original schedule, the episode was due to come out on November 5th, also known as Election Day, and we weren't really sure how we felt about that, to be quite honest.
Yes, and we knew that we would be distracted that day, so we figured our listeners might be as well, at least our U.S. listeners, but probably globally too. Anyway, I will use this momentary soapbox to say, everybody make a plan to vote.
Yes. So the other reason we decided that we should release back-to-back episodes is that today's conversation with Emma Marris actually ties in really nicely with our episode from last week with Brandon Kim.
Yes, and it's not as if you have to listen to both of these together, but we felt like they're really good bookends. So if you did listen to last week, that's great. But if you didn't, it's not imperative. But we feel like they're really great because they're intertwined about the human and animal relationships that we have been talking about.
Yes. So Emma is a science writer whose work has been published in National Geographic, the New York Times, and the Atlantic. She is author of Rambunctious Garden, Saving Nature in a Post-Wild World. And in her latest book, Wild Souls, Freedom and Flourishing in the Non-Human World, explores a concept of wildness itself.
In this conversation, we chat with Emma about what wildness means on a planet so dominated by humans. What is individual autonomy in the animal world, and why the concept of pristine, untouched nature might be a misguided one.
Absolutely. So let's get to our conversation with Emma Marris.
Emma, you're here. We're so thankful to have you with us on the podcast.
I'm thrilled to be here. We're super excited. You have so much fabulous background in environmentalism, sustainability, animals. And I know one of the things I want to dive in and talk about the new book, Wild Souls, but your background is so phenomenal. You do such incredible writing. How did it come about? Like, how did you become a journalist and then an author? Because it's such a wonderful, deep work you're doing.
Yeah, thank you so much. I found out that there was this career called science writing when I was in my early 20s. And at the time, I was working as a secretary at the botany department at the University of Washington. So I had really fallen in love with the science that people were doing there, but I also got a really up-close view of what it was like to be an academic, lab scientist. Wow. And I decided that wasn't quite for me. So I pursued this science writing, master's degree at Johns Hopkins. And that got me in the door to write for places like the journal Nature, which kind of kicked off my writing career. So that's sort of how I found out about it. In fact, it was a lecture by New York Times science writer Gina Kolata at the UW that introduced me to the idea that there was this whole special little box that you could be a science writer. These days, I think I might almost be like a popular philosophy writer as much as I'm a popular science writer, but that's how I got into it.
So I love that. And I love that I have two younger, the boys are now heading into college, but you think about you don't know as a kid what role you want to do or what you're going to go into unless you've been exposed to it. So I think, it's really cool that you kind of started in sort of the botany world with science, but then ended up becoming a writer. I just heard, or somebody just told me, I don't know if it was Perkins and Will, one of the big architecture firms just hired a director of ecology.
Oh,
which I thought was
interesting.
just super, right? And just super cool that it's just being woven into our everyday lives. And I like that you say philosophy. So tell us about the latest book, Wild Souls, Freedom and Flourishing in the Non-Human World, because I think that that's an interesting way that we think about it, right? Animals versus humans, but then thinking of nature. And obviously we use the term biophilia, which I know you're very familiar with, thinking that we're all from the same place. We're all in the same world, but we tend to divide it. Tell us about the book, and then we have a million questions for you.
We do.
Sure.
So, I was reporting on mostly sort of ecology and conservation for like 15 years. And so I was very focused on species level conversations, like how is this species doing, or is this species declining, or what about this population? But I didn't do a lot of thinking about individuals, individual animals, for example. And so this was my second book. My first book was a lot more about trying to define what the goals of conservation should be in a really changing world. And then this book was me trying to wrestle with the fact that the kind of work that we want to do in the world, the sort of like the kind of relationship that we want to have with the other species, this is with individuals, not just with populations and species. And so how does that kind of get into tension with these more species-focused views? But in the end, I decided to make the book about even a broader question, which is just like, what is our relationship with wild animals, or what we call wild animals, and how should we relate to these other individuals that we share the world with? I found that there was a lot more written about the sort of ethics of our relationships with, for example, farm animals, or even there was a lot of really good, really deep and interesting writing about pets and our relationship with our pets.
Sure.
There wasn't a whole lot about, what is my relationship with the squirrels in my backyard or the polar bears that I'm affecting through my actions. So that's what I really wanted to dig into.
I'm so glad you're talking about this, Emma, because Monica and I talk about this all the time separately. And then I think a lot of the conversations are now really focusing on this, like you just said, like other individuals. They're not just, this other thing out there. They're individuals in their own way. And that we have to have relationships with understanding, like, what are these squirrel species or chipmunks, or what kind of birds are there? And the more like you did, the more you start understanding, the more you're interested, of course, the more you want to protect it, because they're all a part of our ecosystem in our communities and, of course, the world. And I think it's fascinating how you kind of broke open the store of like, wow, there's something so much bigger here that we need to really hone in on.
And I think what really drew me to it is I'm always interested in questions where it isn't necessarily like good guys versus bad guys. It's more like two different kinds of good guys come into conflict or tension or an interesting knot. And that was really, to me, the case here, that sometimes what a conservationist would do, the kind of actions they might take on the landscape to save a species, might involve killing individual animals. And so from a sort of an animal rights or animal welfare point of view, those actions would be pretty bad. So how do we adjudicate between these two kind of good guy philosophies, the sort of animal rights perspective and the conservation, let's say the species perspective?
Well, and wolves come up, which I think is an interesting one. I believe you even posed the question, like, are wolves wild? We've sort of bred them in captivity, put them back into the wild. Is that still a wild animal because we've managed that population? I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and this question of whether certain animals are wild or not sounds like maybe it's just very academic, but I think that there's real implications here because we have certain ideas about what our relationship should be with quote unquote wild animals. I mean, a lot of us were raised with this idea of let nature take its course. So that if an animal is kind of classified as wild, we will think kind of our default position will be that we shouldn't really have any interactions with them. We should just keep our distance. But the weird thing is that that's not sort of how conservationists do it. They're moving things around. They're taking wolves from Canada and bringing them down to Yellowstone, and then they're monitoring them. And they've got radio collars on them, and they're tranquilizing them to take blood samples. And then they're sometimes there's a famous case where the first wolf moved from Idaho into my state of Oregon, and wildlife managers were like, "We're not ready for this," so they captured it and put it. And
put it back
in Idaho, So we're very interventionist with these animals that many of us think of as the kind of most wild, kind of the icon of wildness, the wolf, So we thought that there was some interesting paradoxes there. And to me, it really raises this question, which is, well, if we are managing them in this way, does that mean that we now actually have more responsibilities towards them, Maybe if these wolves were just sort of running around free and we didn't have anything to do with them, then this sort of leave it alone ethic would be sense. But if we brought them here and now they're getting into trouble with eating livestock or they're having issues, don't we owe them more if we sort of set them up in this new place? So that's the questions that I was looking at there. And I do think it's interesting that, in many states, they have enough radio collars on wolves and they know where the den sites are and they know they have family trees. It's almost as if they're kind of, this sounds a little intense, but it's almost like there are free ranging pets.
That's a good point.
Yeah,
and
interesting.
It's not comfortable for me. I want them to be independent and have their own agency. But the fact is we're monitoring them and managing them so closely that I don't know if they quite qualify as wild.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think of bison and deer as sort of interesting ones as well. I think probably Ted Turner is sort of best known. I mean, in Georgia, at least, for, quote, bringing back the bison, or at least this is the, sort of the way I sort of learned about it, that, he was like, we need to conserve them. The only way we're going to conserve them is to create demand, which I thought was an interesting thing. So then, he started the restaurant chain that was basically based on bison meat. It just seems like a, backward way to think about it. But it was an interesting way that, like, I guess we're just going to have, 10 of them in a little conservation pen, or we can have them, quote unquote, wild on his land, and they'll be flourishing if we have demand for them. I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I just think it's it's sort of like a success story, right? But is it?
Yeah. A friend of mine, Michelle Nijhuis, wrote a book called Beloved Beasts that looks at the kind of really interesting, deep stories of conservation of a few kind of iconic species, and one of them is bison. So I would recommend checking that book. It's really fascinating.
Okay, yeah.
The whole story. And I think bison are interesting because they do straddle this line between what we think of as a wild animal and what we think of as a domestic animal. So on the one hand, you have Ted Turner, who's all like, well, we're going to kind of save this by commodifying it.
Right.
And then on the other hand, I've written about restorationists who are trying to put bison back on landscapes, who've become incredibly purist about there being any cattle genes in the bison that they have on their landscapes. And they only want pure bison on their kind of, but there's actually a real shortage of pure bison in the US. So most of them have a very small percentage of cattle genes. So there becomes this whole, this whole kind of purity focus, that as if wildness is something that's genetic in the genes. And that is one way to look at it. Are these affected by humanity? Does that make it less wild? Okay, but then all of the animals that are adapting to climate change on a genetic level, does that mean they're less wild because we have now changed all of their genes? I think that if we get this purest genetic view, it'll lead us to very strange places where we'll end up with nothing wild. And that's why I really come down on the way that I think it makes sense to define wild in a world that we've changed so much is just individual autonomy. Does this animal have make its own choices? So in the case of wolves, their autonomy might be a little bit lower than like a ground squirrel that's never going to get radio collared or in a box. And with a bison, you might have a bison in a pen that's being managed, that's going to be either managed for conservation or managed for meat. But if it's very contained, it might be less wild than a bison that has a much bigger range and is able to migrate, for example. So I really think that's kind of, I came down with autonomy, individual autonomy as the way to define wildness. And I think that works best in our messy, crazy, humanized world.
It's beautiful, actually, Emma, like when you think about that, because you're right. You have to go into these deep places that are often uncomfortable and things that we haven't discussed before. So how do we then put them in boxes yet that are supposed to be wild? And then they were changing the DNA. And even like, I think you wrote about how we are like, there's deer season, or I live in New York City and I just found out last week they were hunting 1 week. They could hunt bear with a bow and arrow. And I thought, what? 1 week they're going to hunt bear with bows and arrows? Then I had that conflict of just so they can secure the land's overpopulation, that kind of thing. So it's going back to that wildness. Are we trying to control, and we're impeding on their homes, we're the whole urban sprawl that we have, and then we're building in their homes and we're mad about it. It's just, it's an interesting conversation.
Yeah, I do have a chapter in the book about hunting, and I don't, I end up in a more kind of gray area, complicated place than just, hunting is bad. I mean, there's certainly many situations where people are hunting to feed their families and where they're hunting in old, long traditions that have kind of ethical built into them, either legal or religious, spiritual kind of practices that keep that relationship with the species more sustainable. But I mean, one thing I really wrestled with when writing this book is I think we've all been brought up with this idea that the best way to be good to nature is to not impact it, to kind of withdraw ourselves from it. But that's ultimately on a global scale, that's impossible. Like, we are ecological beings. Even if we're eating plants, and we're eating plants that are grown in fields that are in former habitats of other animals. And there's, we have an ecological impact whether we want to or not. And so I think, the sort of real way to think about this is, how do we make these relationships that we can't opt out of, that we have to have, how do we make these relationships sort of good or reciprocal or mutual rather than just exploited?
Right. So talk about some of the things that we sort of touched on, a little bit of a categorization, right? The pet, which we've obviously, are there pure breeds anymore? I don't know. I mean, the dog shows might tell you yes, but dogs and cats, farm animals, which maybe we can start to put the bison into, is an interesting, right? They're farmed in potentially a more ethical way, right? And then these sort of wild. But talk about some of the language we use around these animals, because I think the squirrel's an interesting one. We don't think of it as wild, but it really is. It has agency.
Yeah, it has. It's out. I actually have a bunch in my yard right outside my office, and I watch them all day going about their mysterious business. And, I don't know exactly what they're up to, but they're very busy. And they just see my backyard as their world, their home. We have this overlapping kind of ownership over this space that I think is interesting. And when I was writing the book, I had a family of skunks living under my house.
Oh my gosh.
And I just let them be, and was basically like, okay, kids, like if you see them, just back up, and we never.
Yeah, absolutely. You better back up.
But categorization is really interesting because let's go back to the wolves as an example, right? Like, wolves are genetically, there's some argument about whether they're the same species as dogs, but they're incredibly closely related to dogs, and they can interbreed with dogs, and those puppies will be fertile themselves. So by a sort of and yet the dog is, in the old phrase, quote unquote, man's best friend. It's like the closest animal to us. It's the animal that we let into our bed, And then the wolf is like the most wild. It's like the king of the wilderness, standing there howling at the moon. And yet they're the same species. So it really shows that a lot of these categories are really cultural ideas about how these animals ought to behave and where they belong. And they can get really hairy. So I tell in the book a story about when there were some wolves in Washington State that started hanging out with domestic dogs, and they were going to have some puppies. And wildlife managers were freaking out because at that time the wolves were still highly endangered. But dogs running around the countryside were considered feral animals that could be shot at will. And so what would you do with mixed family where some of them are highly prized, endangered animals that we're willing to spend a huge amount of money to protect, and some of them are essentially fair game for anybody. And what do you do with the puppies? What category do you put them in? So they ended up intervening and ending the pregnancy so they wouldn't be in that.
Wow.
Yeah, they came and they gave this wolf an abortion, essentially.
Wow.
Just crossing these categories that we have, set up. But of course, the animals don't have these categories. They're not like, well, hello, I'm a wolf. Oh, hello, I'm a sheepdog,
Right. Well, and it's
sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. That's like shocking and fascinating. And so and back to the categories, when it was Idaho went to Oregon, the wolf, same thing. Like we've drawn these like lines on this map that are just made up. I mean, we put meaning behind them, but what's the difference, right? It's just, to your point, the squirrel doesn't know it's your house, that it's your house versus the neighbor's house, and they're going to like knock on the fence and head over there for nuts. And it's just a really interesting way to think about it. But that's interesting. It's almost like the group that did it, and no, I'm not trying to trash them because I don't know. I'm sure they did have the best intention.
They were in a very difficult position, and they were trying to law.
But at the same time, you're like, was that was for the humans? It wasn't for the wolf. It was so we maybe didn't have the moral dilemma once the puppies were born. Well, we're just going to cancel out that equation. Yeah. Which again, is that moral? Is that fair?
Yeah.
The other category that I think it's worth thinking about hard is the category of a pest. And a lot of times these are animals that are not native. So I write in the book a lot about New Zealand because it's the place where there's a biggest sort of societal effort to get rid of non-native animals. And that's because New Zealand has a very particular, interesting island ecology where they didn't have a lot of mammals, bats and seals. And so they had birds fulfilling a lot of those ecological roles, many of whom were flightless. And so then when mainland mammals show up, they become very dangerous to those kind of unique birds that New Zealand has.
Sure.
So there's been this sort of countrywide push that they call it Predator Free 2050 to get rid of various kinds of stoat and Australian possums and rats.
Wow.
And it's not wildlife managers, it's also the citizens, doing trapping and getting really into it. So I write about a case, for example, where there was a woman who was given a fine for neglecting her pet rabbit, like the same week that the government sprayed poison over a huge forested area and killed like probably tens of thousands of Australian possums that are very similar sort of cognitively to the rabbit, but because one was the pest and one was the pet, we had completely different
fascinating
rights to handle them and what they and whether or not you can kill them, and and these poisons aren't a super nice way to go either. They're kind of
sure,
I can't imagine.
But I'm sure it was efficient.
Yeah, well, I mean, I really feel for the New Zealanders because I understand how excited they are about their native species and how passionate they are about protecting them. There are criticisms that a lot of the focus is on these non-native predators rather than, habitat loss or how much of the land are we handing over to sheep farming. But I do think it's the case that it's harder to keep these native animals around when you have rats and stoats and Australian possums around. And so it puts them in a really, really tough ethical position.
But it's a great point though, Emma, like you're saying, is like that, because Monica is such a stickler about like how we use language and words really matter. So I've learned so much from Monica. She really like emphasizes, like what you just said, like pets versus pests. And how do we have these conversations broader and with their own family and children to understand, like, how are we speaking about these very beings? And then how we treat them is really important to learn. And then again, it impacts our environment, our local environment and global environment.
Yeah, one of the other things I think about is pests, or just like, are they causing disruption, right? Like possums eating or deer eating vegetables or flowers, or possums digging in your garden, or carpenter ants, right? Digging through wood. It's just an interesting, and so then we try to either eradicate or remove them from our little world we've created, but and then how do you do it? Like what's ethical about it? So one of the things that I wanted to bring up was the zoo, right? So we have conservation, we have sanctuaries, and then we have zoos. And zoos are, I don't know if you have kids, but like have been amazing to take your kids to and see all the animals. And one of the things that I think I wrote down here was that, sometimes the zoo, what was it that, animals that draw people to the zoo tend to be the ones that are least happy in captivity. I was thinking about the elephants. We had just had an individual, a guy on, Brandon Kim, who wrote a book on Meet the Neighbors, and it was, you can think about squirrel. Exactly. Yeah. And so we had a little bit of a conversation there, but I'd love to hear your point of view on kind of like, or just where people are landing on zoos right now, because I think they're wonderful for education and for people to be able to see an animal in person. but it's not in the wild, you know?
Yeah. So when I put this book together, I started with a lot of questions about the kind of ways that professional conservationists were interacting with wild animals, like, moving wolves around or killing non-native species. But I really wanted to also get into questions about how people who are not professional conservationists are interacting with what we call wild animals, because most of my readers aren't going to be professional conservationists. So that's why I decided to cover also things like hunting and zoos. So I put zoos on my list, and I really went into the research for that chapter with a very open mind. I didn't have a real strong point of view going in. So I just kind of dug in and sort of said, okay, so how are zoos presenting themselves? Like, what are they saying the benefits of their institutions are?
Right.
And it seems like they said, there's sort of two main things. And one is that they often, it's now required to be accredited that you are a conservation focused institution. So they're both sort of, presenting themselves as institutions that do conservation and as institutions that educate people and kind of win people's hearts over so that they will then support conservation. So those are sort of the two there. So I looked at the evidence to back up that these two things are actually being accomplished by zoos. And I was actually pretty surprised about how bad the evidence is. There isn't a lot of clear evidence that people who go to the zoo suddenly become conservationists or care more about the environment. The evidence, people have tried to study this, and people don't read the signs. They don't necessarily connect what they're seeing to the conservation messaging. Most people go for a fun day out with the family. And in terms of actually doing conservation, there are certain zoos that have active captive breeding programs. But even at those zoos, they'll typically have, 1 to 3, a few species that are in programs in which someday some of them will be let back out. But the vast majority of the animals that they have are not in conservation breeding programs. Those animals are never getting out. It can be a little confusing because for example, the breeding plans that zoos put together for animals like elephants or tigers are called species survival plans. So it sounds like the breeding activity is for conservation. But for many of these species, like big cats or like elephants, it doesn't work to take zoo animals and dump them back out into the wild. Like, that's not how conservation for these species is done. Yeah. The way that serious conservation is done for something like a tiger or an elephant is to protect its habitat and prevent killing. And so these populations that they're breeding are never going to get out, and their kids are never going to get out, and their grandkids are never going to get out. Like, they're just in there for us to look at forever.
Right. I know.
And they're not happy in there. There is actually a lot of research showing that many of these bigger species are unhappy. Many of them are given, Prozac by the zoos. Many apes attempt to escape repeatedly. There's a lot of physical signs you can see in animals, a lot of repetitive behaviors like swaying or pacing or flicking of the tongue. So even, I've been to zoos as part of the research for this, and you can see that behavior right on display. So I was really sort of surprised that by the end of all my research, I kind of decided that I don't think zoos should just shut up shop tomorrow, but I think they should stop breeding animals just for display. I don't think that.
I agree.
I just don't. So, but even if they stopped breeding animals just for display tomorrow, there would still be a long time in which the animals that they have now that probably can't live in the wild could be part of, lovingly cared for. And I want to make very clear that, most zookeepers, zoo employees, zoo staff are passionate about the animals that they care for, and they do absolutely do their best to give those animals a good life. And many of them probably do have a good life. I just don't think that we should be breeding animals to spend their entire lives and the lives of all of their descendants in captivity just for us.
I agree. And you're right, because I feel like so many of us have spent our childhoods and our lives going to zoos for education or for fun. But I see it every day. I walk by the Central Park Zoo and I see that big brown bear in that cage, and he just all day long, and it breaks my heart. There's nothing I can do. But I think you're absolutely right. That's a really good point. I never thought about how do we stop just breeding these poor creatures just for us to look at. And it's just, it really breaks your heart.
It's like, it's uncomfortable knowledge, right? And so as somebody, and I love that you're like, I went in super open-minded, you kind of come out with an overarching view, but what if we could just do this, stop doing this one thing potentially, but it's like, once you have that uncomfortable knowledge, it's very difficult to understand what to do with it. And I like that you say you're almost a philosopher now, because I do think that we, human society, are needing to start thinking about the philosophical questions with nature, climate change, and animals. And I don't like it. I don't like thinking about a zoo as a negative place, because I have so many positive experiences and connotations with it. So then it's like, oh, you're making me work. You're making me think. You're making me question where I stand on something.
Monica. You can't unsee it.
And it's just very hard, And I think so many people, and I'm sort of going to dovetail into more of a question about like climate and animals. It's clearly not working with the zoos, with the conservation, whether we're not reading or trying to chase our child down and keep them happy to go see whatever animal. But how do we, shift the thinking, right? I don't know if any of us have that answer, but it's like we have this fundamental problem with environmentalism as well. And we keep thinking, well, if we can educate people, that will help them, want to save whatever it is they've learned about. But sometimes I worry that it's just the uncomfortable knowledge. And then we're just like, I'm going to go watch some Netflix over here and not think about it.
Right. Yeah, that's a very real thing. And I've been there.
Yeah.
Like maxed out and had to go watch Netflix. And, I do this for a living. So I know that's very real.
Yeah.
Do you think that, the idea that if we can bring people start understanding that humans are part of nature, that animals are part of nature, that we are actually all part of the same ecosystem. And I think I wrote down, I really liked how you're like, we are ecological beings and we have an ecological impact. If we sort of start there, do you find those conversations help move people a little bit? Reframing?
Yeah. I think it's certainly helped me because, I think, what you just described is sort of where I feel like a lot of people are with environmentalism broadly, which is that we feel that the only way to be ethical is to have no impact. And since that's not possible, we live in a kind of a constant shame spiral, right? Like we're always there feeling guilty. And that's not a place from which we can really do much.
No.
We check in with this idea of, everything I do is ruining the planet. And we very quickly shut down and we're back to Netflix and ice cream and just like blocking it out. So I think we do have to start with like accepting the fact that we are ecological beings and then sort of trying to build a shared understanding of how to sort of be good ecological beings.
Right.
Given the fact that like there is no way for us to live without impacting other organisms, just like any other animal, we need energy and we're going to get that, and we get our energy from other organisms, and that's the nature of us as animals. So we're going to start there, but just because we're going to eat other organisms doesn't mean that we're going to just be villains and despoilers and exploiting them. There are ways in which we can have a kind of reciprocal relationship where we're also giving back to these same organisms or to their to organisms that we're not eating, to all the organisms, and like we're sharing the space, we're sharing those flows of energy. I think sometimes one of you mentioned the sort of the fact that we're in this global ecosystem, and that's absolutely true. We are in a gigantic global ecosystem, and sometimes it's like in the Matrix where I'm seeing the source code. I feel like it's all these flows of energy all around the world, this gigantic web. And so much of it right now is flowing towards humanity. We're just sucking the energy out of all of the other. But there are ways for us to thrive together mutually, where we can thrive and we can also be pushing energy back towards those other systems. So what does this mean in practice? How do we work out all the details? Should we be feeding polar bears? Should we be building wildlife underpasses? Should we be reducing our footprint on the land and making sure that there's more kind of uncommercialized landscape? Like maybe, I don't know about feeding polar bears. I have a whole chapter about whether we should be feeding polar bears. But, there are things that we can do that kind of give back.
I'm thinking like I don't know if this is true or not. I'm maybe just projecting myself. I feel like there's excitement in you and like there's something else stirring that maybe you're working on for something next. But I guess my question though is, did you get inspired writing your last book to write this one? Like, were there things in there? Because I kind of feel like there's lots of things that are interwoven in your Rambunctious Gardens book that kind of really speak to what you're talking about now in this book. Did you get inspired writing that book to write this one?
Well, there's 10 years in between Rambunctious Garden and Wild Souls. And partly that's because I had 2 kids and, you know.
Yeah.
So it's like,
life.
Yeah, it looks like my great work coming a decade apart, but if you count the kids, they're actually like every 3 years. But I am working on another book, and I think it is fair to say that all of my books are flowing into each other. You know, Rambunctious Garden was really about this question of, are humans part of nature? And if we are, then how do we see our job? What are our goals? If we're not trying to kind of extract ourselves and make the world look like it did before humans messed it up, then what are our goals? And then that brought me to, you know, and I do kind of talk about some of those themes in Wild Souls as well, because the whole kind of let nature take its course, don't intervene in the lives of wild animals, kind of, that's coming from that same place of humans and nature are separate. I think is so misguided. And so if you break that wall in between us and all of our fellow species, it actually is almost exhausting at first, because you're like, okay, now we're going to figure out the kind of good relationship with all of these other millions of species that now we're in relationships with, or now that we're going to acknowledge that we have relationships with. And it's an incredible, complicated puzzle. Like, how do we exist in a way that's not selfish? So the third book, the one that I'm working on now, is along those themes. It is along the themes of sort of seeing that global flow of energy and thinking about ways to like spread that out between us and all the other species we share the world with more fairly.
I'm already excited.
Before we let you go, I did want to touch on indigenous areas, because I think that's, you know, sort of some lessons learned. Can you speak on that? How indigenous protected areas might be a way forward for us?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, when I was doing the research for Wild Souls, one thing I wanted to do was look at all the different ways in which humans interact with quote unquote wild animals. And this kind of Western notion of humans over here, everybody else over there is kind of, you know, if you look at cultures across the world, most cultures actually don't do that. Most cultures place humans in a kind of an ongoing inner relation with a lot of other animals and plants. And those relationships can be hierarchical, they can be equal, but they're always kind of ongoing, and there's negotiations, there's reciprocities, there's not this that we're on somehow different planets or dimensions than the other species. There's a lot to learn from that. And we don't have to reinvent the wheel when we think about our relations with other species. There are many different indigenous traditions that have a lot of knowledge and wisdom on this that we can turn to. And as you alluded to, you can kind of see the sort of quote unquote success of those approaches in the statistics on how well indigenous managed protected areas manage to do in terms of protecting different populations and species. They tend to outperform a kind of a more Western style park where you kind of put a fence around it and you don't allow any kind of use or interaction. So the implication there is that there are some kinds of uses or interactions that are positive, that actually do help other species more than just quote leaving them alone. And so I think that's a really, you know, that's something worth pursuing and learning more about, but it's also, you know, conveniently enough, it's aligned with this sort of greater justice of making sure that people's land rights are secure and that they have authority over the lands that are theirs. So, you know, you get two great outcomes there.
I remember reading, was it like The Secret Life of Trees, you know, where you start to learn about trees and, you know, the relationship with the mushrooms and the fungi beneath the land, or even the ribosomes in a farmland, you know, and so I know we always say this, it's like begins with education, which I think is super important, but I have to be really willing to have the conversation too, because again, I'm just as zoo is my example right now. It's like, it just makes me uncomfortable to think it wouldn't be available or it didn't exist. But it is this sort of, if you step back and an alien dropped down, they'd be like, well, what's this living animal museum you've created? Like, it's big animal jail? Like, what's going on? Like, so I think, if we sometimes step back and think, okay, just coming in blind, why are we doing this thing? And so we always, Jen and I and others in sort of our little world, we'll always say, like, are we asking the right questions? And I think that's hugely what you've done here, is starting to ask the questions for us.
And maybe we can just patch this, back into the zoo conversation, but I would love to just sort of like paint a picture of what that transformed zoo could look like. Because I do think it's, in many cities or towns, zoos are so institutionally important and they are so much a part of the community that, just shutting them down isn't necessarily the answer here. But I think that if you stop doing breeding for display, you can see this gradual transition into something that's kind of a combination of a refuge for animals that really just can't, and maybe a conservation breeding facility that would really focus more on animals from that environment, from that area, which would help people more in touch with the animals from their own ecosystem. And then you could also boost up the plants. I myself am a huge fan of botanical gardens. I love plants. I feel like they deserve more love. And so I think you could see a gradual evolution of the zoo away from something that's like, every zoo has an elephant, every zoo has a tiger. That's actually place-based, that's much more about.
Oh, that is great. No, that's fantastic, because you're totally right. Because I start to think like, oh, the African savanna in the zoo at Georgia. Well, those plants, probably are not in the right zone. So I can't show these animals in their quote native habitat. But what if you could? What if it was more place-based? I absolutely adore that. That's wonderful. Very cool.
And,
that makes a lot of sense.
Oh, well, people won't go if there's not an elephant. But, people go to botanical gardens. Like, people will go to a place that's it's inviting and that's speaking to them and, has like art shows and holiday lights.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
100%.
no, I think that's great. I love that idea. Here it would be like we're in the Piedmont region, but what animals, and we know, like, I'm sitting within, acres of wooded area. Our little community is set within thousands and thousands of acres, and we preserve 70% of the land, and we only build on 30 for many, many reasons.
Community, Monica.
It's called Serenbe. So we're just outside of Atlanta, like just
heard of Serenbe. Yeah. That's really cool.
Yeah, you need to come visit.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's really great. And Jen's been, and we have actually an amazing bookstore, Hills and Hamlets, here that you could come do a book signing at. It's a New York Times reporting.
You're just making me jealous.
Sorry, well, Jen, you down too.
I'll come. I'll
where
go.
are you thinking?
I'm in New York City.
Well, I've written about how wild New York City is, how it's just filled with wild animals, migrating birds, rats, and coyotes and raccoons, occasionally Eurasian eagle owls. Like, you got it all.
We got it all.
See?
We do. We really do.
But that's just like digging in and realizing what you have. And again, back to place-based, to educate what's here. Like I mentioned to somebody somebody saw a bobcat on the trails one evening, which is pretty rare because they're shy little guys. But they didn't even realize that they were here. So even just, I like that idea of place-based of, even the squirrels are different, regionally. So what's the difference and why are they colored, So I think if we could get in there, I think that would be a lot of fun to really understand. What are my animals here? Is there anything we haven't, exactly. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you want to share, or is the book in any kind of, do we have a timeline on it, or?
Well, it came out, sort of during high pandemic, so it kind of went under
this one, the Wild Souls, for sure, So probably not a lot of in-person book signings.
Oh, it was rough. But the new one is still very much early stages, so I don't have any timeline on that. I publish here and there, and sometimes I'm in the New York Times, sometimes I'm in the Atlantic, so you can see me around.
Yeah, well,
We'll
put
keep
your
an eye
website in
out.
the show notes. And do you like Instagram or Facebook or LinkedIn? Is
Oh.
there a place that people can find you best?
Got off all of the socials like a year ago, and
Good for you.
Good for you.
really
Yeah.
fun. And partly it was because I was working on this book, but I wasn't working on this book because I was just on flipping Instagram all the time.
Yeah, I
And
understand.
the other ones, and I wasn't, and I was like, I was not. It's a side note, but I had sort of banned social media from my tweens, and so I was noticing that we were around the living room, and they would be reading books, and I would be just scrolling, and I was like,
wow.
So I got off from all the socials, and my book consumption rate has like tripled in the past year. It's been great.
Wow, that's fantastic. That is fantastic.
Yeah,
it was like,
I know.
Emma, I really want to for
I just
a
wanna
week
say-
or so, but I recommended it. It was great.
I think it's powerful once we do it. Once we do it like for 1 week and then you do it another and then you're like, oh my gosh, it's been a month and it feels you feel good.
Yeah.
You feel good and energized. It's incredible. It's like junk food. Like you said, Netflix and chill kind of stuff. It
is. It just is a pure distraction. There's really not much great in there, except when you can, whatever is it, book talk.
Well, that's the
book
thing.
talk.
If I write
It's
this
so
book
hard.
and coming out, my agent will probably make me get back on. But
back on,
for
right?
now,
Mhm.
I'm gonna take a break.
I like it. That's great.
Well, Emma, I really want to say thank you too. Like Monica, we're just so appreciative for your knowledge and your passion for this because these conversations need to be had and young people need to know about them. I just so thankful that you came on the show just to talk about your book. We're very, very thankful.
Me. It's been delightful.
Yeah. Well, and we'll make sure we'll keep an eye out for all of the upcoming articles.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emma.
I love this conversation so much, especially in light of our conversation with Brandon last week.
Yeah, I thought Emma brought up some great questions. And the first one that comes to mind is, what does wildness mean? Wolves were the example that we really sort of like held on. And there was a tension between, yes, they're wild, kind of in quotes, because they're unpredictable. And I wouldn't want to run into one while I'm out walking. But we humans have taken these very drastic measures to preserve the population. And so are they still wild? Question mark.
Question mark. Well, and that also gets to the question of what we talked about towards the end of the conversation about Western perspectives versus indigenous outlooks, where there is much less separation between the human world over here and the animal world over there. Like we're just unnecessarily siloing ourselves from the rest of nature.
Yeah, and I love the way Emma described the global flow of energy and how it could just move towards a way of thinking where we're part of a large interconnected ecosystem of animals and nature. And I just think that would be such a beneficial way for us to reframe how we think about these animals.
Oh, I know. Okay, wait, side note. I know it won't come out for a while, but I need Emma's new book like yesterday. One more thing I really want to touch on before we wrap up is this notion of pristine, untouched wilderness that so many conservationists promote.
Yeah, I thought Emma's perspective on this was really interesting.
Right, and how thinking of it in those terms is another way to separate ourselves from nature. Not that I'm advocating for bulldozing preserved areas and building a bunch of suburban homes, but for a philosophical perspective, it's interesting to kind of think about.
Definitely. And it's not straightforward at all. In our research for the Jeff Speck episode, there was a talk where he calls humans a destructive species and says the best thing we can do is to stay away from nature. So it's not like our guests see eye to eye on the question either.
Right? We are a negative force in so many ways, but we don't have to be.
So we definitely recommend ordering your copy of Wild Souls. As always, it's linked in our show notes along with some articles and talks from Emma.
We also linked Emma's other book, Rambunctious Garden, because we highly recommend that one as well.
All right, Jen. See you in a couple weeks.
Bye, Monica.
Thanks so much for listening. If you've enjoyed the podcast, we would love for you to follow us on our favorite listening app. Give us a 5-star rating and please leave us a review.
Listens, follows, and reviews really go such a long way and help us share these amazing interviews and solutions for a wider network.
Absolutely. And we'll be back with another great guest in a few weeks.